This is 8 Minute Climate Fix, a podcast helping you understand the energy and climate challenge in just a few minutes. I'm your host, Paul Schuster. So I've talked on this show before about the challenges we're facing in trying to decarbonize the space heating in our buildings. And while individual buildings can transition to electric heat pumps, it's a lot more complicated at a macro level. We have an entire gas distribution industry with millions of miles of embedded infrastructure that needs to come along for the ride somehow. And it's not just a matter of letting the shift towards heat pumps just happen naturally. If everyone installed new equipment tomorrow, maybe there's an argument to shut down a pipeline or distribution network, but not everyone installs on the same timeline. What happens to those who take a bit longer to transition off of gas? Are they now bearing the cost of operating and maintaining a piping network originally designed for millions of homes? How should we be thinking about a just, equitable transition from gas to electric, one that brings along all consumers and supports the local gas distribution companies as well? To start to think about this question, I'm joined by one of the premier voices in this area, Jan Rosenow. Jan is the Vice President and European Program Director at the Regulatory Assistance Project, and I'm excited to dive into this topic with him. 8 minutes. It's how long it takes the sun's race to hit Earth, or about the amount of time you have left until the holidays are upon us. Okay, I'm kidding. A little. But we all know these last few weeks are going to fly by. Let's get it on. The uneven pace of the energy transition requires sophisticated support and policy making at a global level, something that Jan and the Regulatory Assistance Project specialize in.
At RAP, we focus on advising policymakers, regulators, other organizations on clean energy policy and regulation. Really, our main aim is to improve the policy and regulatory framework so we can allow technologies that provide energy that's clean and more efficient to the world, and do so in a way that hopefully is also very cost effective.
One area of focus is with gas distribution companies. As households and companies start to electrify and remove themselves from the gas grid, what does that mean for the existing infrastructure and the remaining customers? And there is a lot of existing infrastructure.
In Europe, we have 130,000 kilometers of gas transmission pipelines. You can do the maths. That's about 3 times, maybe a little bit more, of the circumference of the Earth. And we have around 1.8 million kilometers of distribution pipeline infrastructure. That's almost 50 times the circumference of the Earth.
So what do you do with all that existing infrastructure? If we're to meet the globe's GHG emissions reduction commitments by 2050, we will need to reduce gas usage on the order of 70%. But what happens to all that existing pipeline?
And this is really important because these assets have very long lifetimes. I mean, just to maybe give you some numbers here, typically for a new gas distribution or transmission pipeline system, you could have 80 years of lifetime, right? And if you then work back from 2050, which is when most of the world has agreed now to decarbonize, actually the numbers just don't add up. You might be ended up with stranded assets that still have lots of lifetime in them and haven't been depreciated.
So we've got assets in the ground which investors and operators still want to use, but a declining customer base with which to socialize those costs against. That leads to higher costs, higher fees that are typically borne by lower income customers who don't have the capital to invest in new technologies the way wealthier customers may.
It's also correct that often it's wealthier customers who switch first, who electrify, switch away from the gas grid, and especially people on lower incomes who might be tenants, who might not actually have any means of deciding about their heating system because they don't own the building, right? They're just renting it. They might be the last ones on the gas grid, and in a worst outcome, they would then be faced with those horrific increases in fees.
Obviously, managing this transition is critically important to policymakers. And while there have been good efforts made to begin to navigate this changing dynamic, Jan points out that we need more research and innovation into this space. To get that started, he suggests 3 things that policymakers should be thinking about with regards to their local distribution companies and the transition from gas. Number 1.
You should actually prioritize lower-income customers first. You should not just offer lots of subsidy and be happy with wealthy people creaming off the subsidy and building in some heat pumps and electrifying the heating and switching away from the gas grid. You should actually have programs that are deliberately designed and are accessible to low-income groups, people who might not be the front runners when it comes to technology adoption. And that's really important.
Jan also suggests making it easier for gas distribution companies to financially and economically decommission their pipeline network.
For example, you can depreciate assets earlier. At the moment, when a lot of people are still connected to the gas grid, even if you just change the gas grid fees a little bit, have a little adder, you can accelerate depreciation of existing assets.
That's important, as depreciating existing pipelines quicker ensures that once we come up against 2050 or whenever, we don't have a whole bunch of stranded pipe that still have financial value to them. Get them off the books as quick as you can. And then Jan's last point.
There's also cost to decommissioning. So in some areas where there's simply no more any significant gas use, we will have to decommission the gas grid, right? And that's a distribution grid primarily. And in order to do that, there needs to be some sort of fund available to pay for that, because there is a cost to decommissioning to make the gas grid safe. That's still there. And that should be paid for, again, in the earlier years, rather than the last customers on the gas grid being faced with that cost of decommissioning.
As Jan emphasizes, the point is not to wait until the last minute. Judicious policy today can ensure that late adopters aren't saddled with enormous costs and fees. We need to modify programs to support LMI customers more, allow for more accelerated depreciation, and then fund decommissioning earlier. Those are the things policymakers should do to move the transition forward, but there are also a lot of things that have already been done that hamper our adoption of clean technologies. Jan points out that gas disconnect fees, for instance, disincentivize consumers from switching due to the high costs. But he also points out how misaligned efficiency incentives could be hurting us too.
The efficiency targets for electricity have always been higher historically than for gas. So the cost involved and the cost put onto electricity bills versus gas bills are not in sync as a result of that. That's one of the key obstacles for people who might want to switch and consider electrification, but there's this added policy cost and the carbon price they then suddenly face if they electrify.
That's counterproductive, where we make it more expensive to electrify rather than the other way around. Managing the eventual step down of our gas distribution network is going to be complicated, messy, but we can do more today to make certain it's not disastrous.
Because if you don't address this head on, you create a big problem, either for the companies themselves and their business model, because they might suddenly find themselves with stranded assets, but also for the customers who have to pay for this. We should avoid it by smart regulation and make sure that we set the framework up in such a way that we have a managed transition that provides clarity, that gets us to where we need to get to, but do so in a way that is not harmful, especially to those households who might be on very low incomes and be struggling.
I'm Paul Schuster, and this has been your 8 Minutes.